This is a wonderfully exciting part of the research agenda, but it combines with the other areas to make what I think is a fantastic program for ADAPT 2. So Naomi challenged me to talk about drivable and attentive AI. And for me, these are two areas that bring together the different strands to really give a focus on some of the big challenges that face us as we move forward with the emergence of AI technologies. So let's talk a little bit about them. So drivable AI, I think for me, and certainly many of the areas of research we're doing in ADAPT, is about trying to understand this balance of control as humans and different stakeholders might exert over AI and ML processes versus proactivity. So when those processes have learned something and can act on something or make a kind of a determination on something, and to be able to balance those two things. And I think for me, it comes down to this idea of purposeful design, that we're very clear when we're leveraging these technologies about what our goals, our objectives, constraints, and indeed the obligations are that are placed upon them, and be able to articulate those in a meaningful way. There's a lot of bad machine learning done, and you see people dropping data into boxes, getting results, and then actioning things based on those results. But if they don't pause and think about the provenance of the data, think about the methods that were utilized within inside those algorithms, and then think about the context in which they're using that, you can run into very quick problems. And they also need to be controllable, but also tunable by the stakeholders involved. And that leads then hopefully to transparent, robust, and then AI agency that works at a level that's appropriate. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about this idea of agency and AI as part of this presentation. So if that's drivable, the other side then is attentive. Well, what does it mean to be attentive? Well, for us, I think it's about looking at the minimum amount of data, only collecting and utilizing what is needed to help make a call. And that's really different to what's been happening in many places in the market currently, where you have big actors consuming large amounts of data, turning it all into features and trying to learn on top of that. Whether those features make sense together or there's any limitations that should be placed, they haven't been considered. So it comes down to this idea of accountability and inclusion, that you're accountable for what you're processing and working with, and you're only including the data in there that makes sense. And again, the same kind of ideas that you're very clear about your goals, objectives, constraints, and obligations. Our AI systems don't sit in isolation. They're not some thing that we have no control over, that we just kind of get running and say, it'll come up results, and sure, we'll do what the AI says. I mean, that's not acceptable. We have to have control over these technologies. From the digital enhanced engagement side of things, we're very much interested in the individual perspective. And while the human is important across all areas of ADAPT, I think we have a very specific focus on individuals modeling their interests, knowledge, capabilities, and then trying to reproduce various different representations of them. So I mentioned the idea of voice, but it could be a visual representation, whether it's a digital game like Avatar, or it's something that's trying to become very photorealistic. And at the same time, we're trying to leverage those avatars in a variety of different situations. So one of the things we're trying to achieve is this idea of the digitally enhanced human. So what does that mean? Well, this is a human who is essentially empowered by all of these technologies and services that are working around us and for us, that allow us to engage with a whole range of different digital technologies, and allow us to have kind of a diversity and range of experiences beyond what we can currently engage with. So one way I originally talked about this was the idea of a multi-threaded human, and that only makes sense to computer scientists, but the idea that you have all of these different digital threads working in parallel to your current activity and doing stuff for you. And of course, that raises a whole range of really interesting questions. First one is autonomy and the ability for them to act with authority. What does it mean when one of my avatars goes and does something? The digitally enhanced human is at the core objective of this strand, that we're trying to research and develop new multimodal experiences and autonomous agents that are kind of mediated with the human control. So human control is really important in this strand, because we want to ensure that if you have all of these threads operating on your behalf and doing things for you, how can you control them to ensure that they're acting in appropriate ways? And it raises a whole suite of very interesting ethical challenges with regard to this type of work. So different areas that we're looking at within this strand are these idea of personal AI agents that will proactively do things on your behalf. They could be very mundane things like, ordering different products that you might need on a continuing basis, or they could be something much more involved, such as, attending a Zoom meeting on your behalf. And what does that mean then? Can it speak on your behalf, or is it purely there as a receiver to listen and try and figure out what was discussed and then summarize it for you? What does it mean when half the people in a meeting are sending their Zoom avatars that are acting on their behalf and maybe interacting on their behalf? So certainly raises some interesting opportunities and challenges. And in order to do this, we need to have very good representations of the user in terms of their goals, their attitudes, how they do things stylistically, the knowledge that they might have, the knowledge that they might bring to bear in that situation. And then how do we, going back to the point, is how do I set strategies for those kind of avatars? What might they be trying to achieve on my behalf in a medium term or a longer term sense? And that shifts up social norms. I mean, if half the avatars in a meeting are Zoom avatars, not the real people, what happens when you're the only human in the room and everybody else has been represented by some form of agent? Because you end up with the potential for these machines to be acting with agency. What does that mean for legal situations? What does that mean for them enacting contracts, whether they're, legal contracts or just social contracts? So it becomes quite an interesting challenge and quite a very interesting challenge for users to try and control. But if these are the kind of crazy area that we're going in, what can we do? Well, we're building on a heritage of really fantastic research in ADAPT in areas such as personalization, user modeling, but I have the word holistic in there. So, trying to model very deep understandings of what is going on by gathering a large volume of information. Yeah, but hang on, hold on. How does that fit with this idea of attentive AI? And these are the kind of challenges that attentive and drivable really put to us. How do I attend to just the appropriate bits of information? How do I only gather the appropriate bits of information? And, how do I represent that information? How do I facilitate search and retrieval, and particularly automated search and retrieval, pre-gathering of information on people's behalf, and then overarching all of this, how do I facilitate user control? So there are three research challenges within the strand: proactive experiences and agency, interaction and control, sensing, understanding, and representing, which we call challenge RC 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, just to keep things simple for us, but of course that means nothing to anybody else. But we're investigating some really, really interesting areas. So how do you assemble such experiences proactively? How do you offer different assistive interventions? How do you facilitate dialogue-based interaction and control? How are these agents representing themselves, both visually, vocally? How do you facilitate this continuous modeling of users and their interests and their knowledge? How do people perceive these types of agents? So really challenging areas for us to be performing our research in. So just to draw out a couple of projects that cross-cut different strands. So on the drivable side, we have a really interesting project with Annalena and Afra that's looking at accountable personalization for proactive information retrieval. So, if a machine is gathering information on your behalf, so proactively retrieving information, how do you ensure it's accountable with this idea of what is it gathering? Is it gathering it towards your beliefs? Is it, is it skewing in a certain direction of understanding the world because of how it's gathering that? So that accountability becomes really quite important to understand and model. On the other side, in the attentive, looking at qualitative experience for voice-based chatbot systems, and experience being really quite an interesting term there. So for a long time, people talk about quality of service and mechanistic kind of measures of how the service was delivered. But when people are engaging, think about the holistic experience and how that's balanced. And that's work that's performed by Andrew Hines and John Kelleher.